the Christians were like 4%, to 8% before the World War I period. Then they were less than 1%. The Assyrians just send letters to the British or to the Russians saying, we're being persecuted. Taxation is resulting in us losing most of our crop. Our young women are constantly being abducted. We live in a lack of security. People can randomly kill us on the roads and we don't receive equal justice. So you often read about the Armenians and Assyrians being deported into the interior and then being abused and killed. It's more private. A lot of the Assyrian position collapses and the remaining people are massacred as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution. I call that the reverse CNN effect. Some conflicts get picked out of all the conflicts and elevated to be like, that's the important conflict. Everyone has to pay attention to Sarajevo. Everyone has to pay attention to Kuwait. Everyone has to pay attention to Kiev. But you don't have to pay attention to Sana'a, Yemen. You don't have to pay attention to Tigray, Ethiopia. You don't have to pay attention to Christians in Nigeria. These are like the reverse CNN effect.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Atheniano Show, where each episode is a new ripple, containing unknown but unlimited impact. Genocide is probably one of the worst, if not the worst, crimes that any individual or a group of individuals could commit. It involves the intent to physically destroy an ethnic, religious, national, or racial group. And there are many well-known genocides that you've probably heard of, like the Armenian Genocide, like the Bosnian Genocide, like the Rwandan Genocide, and of course, the Holocaust. But there are also many less well-known and less widely recognized genocides that have taken place throughout history, whose stories and events are equally important to tell, often because the effects of those genocides last well beyond the time that those events took place. And so one of those genocides is the Assyrian Genocide, or the genocide against Assyrians, an ethnically Christian group native to the Middle East. And so to help me highlight and shed light on the Assyrian Genocide and its effects, I have esteemed professor of law at Florida International University, Professor Hannibal Travis. So, Professor Travis, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I'll just give you a brief introduction because I don't have time to go through your entire resume because it's incredibly vast. But Professor Travis is the author of numerous scholarly articles and books on the Assyrian Genocide, including Native Christians Massacred, the Ottoman Genocide of the Assyrians during World War I, Genocide in the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire, Iraq and Sudan, Missions, Minorities, and the Motherland, Xenophobic Narratives of an Ottoman Christian Stabbed in the Back, and the editor and author of 2 chapters in the Assyrian Genocide, Cultural and Political Legacies. And he also, as I mentioned, teaches law at Florida International University, and conducts research in the fields of cyber law, intellectual property, international and comparative law, human rights, genocide studies, antitrust, and telecommunications. So, Professor Travis, again, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Thank you.
So my first question, because I mentioned in the intro that many people probably don't know about the Assyrian Genocide or about the Assyrians as an ethnic group more broadly. So just the first question is, who are the Assyrians? By what other names or labels do people refer to them? And where are they traditionally located, or where is their indigenous home?
Sure. So at the time of the genocide, Assyrians were often called Syrians. There was an American Committee for Armenian and Syrian Relief. And the Syrians were probably so called because at some point the A was dropped off of Assyrian from the ancient Assyrians, and they became known as Syrians or Syrian speakers, Saraye, stuff like that, in the native language. And when they came to the West, that would be translated as Assyrian or Syrian. In the 20th century, there became a lot more usage of the terms Syriac and Chaldean. The Chaldean denomination or faith was started by an Assyrian in the traditionally Assyrian areas and dioceses of Mesopotamia and what is today southern Turkey and northwestern Iran. The Syriac or Syrian Orthodox, there had been a schism between the Church of Edessa, basically the Syrian Orthodox, and the Church of the East, the Church of the Hakkari Mountains, and northwestern Persia, and Upper Mesopotamia. So oftentimes today, you will read the Assyrians, also known as Chaldeans and Syrians or Syriacs. Other people would prefer to say these are three different communities or groups. I suppose it's up to the individual how they would like to slice things up. If you read some of the works of people who have dug into the history of these terms, like Sargon Donabed and William Warda, you can find the case for treating them as all part of one people that tried to seek a state after World War I, but were denied.
And you mentioned the link between the Assyrians and the ancient Assyrian Empire. What evidence is there or materials is there to suggest that the same people that we call Assyrians today are descendants of the Assyrian Empire?
Yeah, so one theory, I suppose, is that Nestorian Christians, Chaldean Christians, branching off from the Nestorian Christians, are basically Christian Kurds or Arabs, because the place Al Jazeera, or the island, had a long Arab heritage. To the east of that, Kurdistan has a Median and Karduchi, or other terms beginning with a K or a C heritage that people link to the Kurds since the 12th or 13th century of the Common Era. In opposition to that, I and others have noted a variety of things. When people do genetic studies, they tend to find a difference between the Assyrians and the Yazidis on the one hand and the Kurds or the Arabs on the other hand, being kind of genetically distinct. Not, in a large percentage, but in certain groups on the Y chromosome, for example. Linguistically, of course, there's a difference between Semitic, Indo-European, and Altaic language families. The Assyrian Empire, the ancient Assyrian Empire, originally used Sumero-Akkadian or Akkadian as the language, and adopted an administrative language of Aramaic, which was becoming kind of a cross-border, or I guess at that time, global, given that the globe was very small in the days before large ships and airplanes, language. So this imperial Aramaic or Aramaic then was handed down to the Persian Empire, and today many of the Christian communities of northern Iraq, eastern Syria, southern Turkey, northern Iran speak this Aramaic language. It has distinctive Akkadian and other influences that sort of signal to some scholars a continuity of populations from the time when the same agricultural or other terms were being used in Akkadian and then shifted over into Aramaic, almost like Latin words into English or something like that. Within the religious histories, you can find texts indicating that the Christians of Edessa and the other areas converted from the worship of, say, Nabu, ancient Assyrian Mercury. Part of the annual New Year's festival was Nabu. So, and in places like Hatra and in Upper Mesopotamia and other places, they find amulets with the gods of the ancient Assyrians: Shamash, Sin, Nabu, Tammuz, all that kind of thing, from medieval times. So the Assyrian Empire was supposed to fall in like 600 before the Common Era and so forth. But they're finding these amulets from 800, 1000, 1200 of the Common Era with the same deities' names on them. So if these people had been ancient Kurds or ancient Turks or ancient Arabs who had converted to Christianity, you should find the Arabian or the Indo-European gods or the Altaic gods, which have different names than Shamash, Sin, uh, Nabu, and Tammuz, um, than the Assyrian names. So that's another point of evidence that I look to. Also, they're in the same place, of course. The city names um, of places like Mardin, Erbil, Urmia, Nineveh Plains, Nineveh Province. These are all ancient Assyrian names and words. Some of them are words.
So, turning more to the time period that the genocide took place and roughly how many people died, how many people fled. I was just wondering if you could briefly speak to the extent to how large of a scale the genocide was. Again, when it took place roughly, and just broadly what the effects were of the genocide.
Yeah, so it kind of depends what you mean by it. If you want to link it to the Armenian genocide, most people talk about 1915 to 1918, but even the Armenian genocide continued past 1918 with the Republic of Armenia and attacks from different armies from Turkey and the Adversaries and the Soviets and so forth. Uh, on the Assyrian side, you can go all the way back to the 1840s. You can go all the way forward to the 1930s. Now, of course, what happened in the 1930s in Iraq is a different regime than the Ottoman Empire, but some of the military officers there, of course, had gone to Ottoman military schools, so there is a certain continuity there too. One way to think about it is a 30-year genocide of 1894 to 1924. But things were still happening, especially in the Iraq, Turkey, or then Iraq, Mesopotamia, Turkey border in 1926. So you'd have to go past 30 years, even within the 20s. And also, in terms of 1914, the effect was more pronounced on the Church of the East Assyrians in Hakkari and close to Urmia, the Ottoman Persian border, than it was for the Syrian Orthodox, who experienced more of a peak in 1915. And it also was more pronounced for the Assyrians and Chaldeans of Urmia in 1918, kind of as a second large wave. Whereas by that time, there are some reports that the Syrian Orthodox had reached kind of an accommodation, or those who were surviving had experienced less persecution in 1918 than in 1915. And that's the time frame. In terms of the numbers, you hear some people talking about, the upper hundreds of thousands, but the Assyrians of the time often spoke of 175 to 250,000 because there were not necessarily a million Assyrians, Chaldeans, and Syrians, even if you add up the Ottoman Empire and Persia at that time. There are estimates going up to 500,000 in Ottoman Empire and Turkey. There are estimates going up to a couple 100,000 in Persia, but it's difficult to get to a million. And in terms of survivors, there were maybe 150,000 or so, but it depends what you're counting. And there may have been some uncounted people who went to places like the United States and Russia. So that can be difficult to count the after period as well. So the numbers are pretty rough. They're also rough for the Holocaust or for the Rwandan genocide or for other events in history. But I put it at about 250,000.
Okay. And so you mentioned that some people consider this a 30-year genocide predating 1914, 1915, and the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So, I mean, I guess the question then is, why were the Assyrians living under the Ottoman Empire? Where in the Ottoman Empire were they living? And how were they treated before this 30-year period, 30-year genocide period in the Ottoman Empire by the authorities, by the other ethnic groups living with them?
Yeah, so I go into this in two of my books. In terms of the coming under the Ottoman Empire, not all Assyrians did fall into the Ottoman Empire. Uh, Prior to the First World War, there was a series of conflicts between the Ottoman Empire and the Persian Empire, in which Kurds often played a part as well. And they basically settled at a border east of the Hakkari Mountains, west of the Urmia Plains, and northwestern Persia, what is today northwestern Iran. So there were, as I said, the bulk of the Syrian-speaking people were to the west of that border in the Ottoman Empire, which also included the three provinces of Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra, and the several provinces of Syria too. So how did that happen? It's a very long story, and it goes through like not only many different governments, but many different types of government. There were local. So after the fall of the Assyrian Empire, there was the Chaldean Babylonian Empire. Then there was the Greek and the Seleucid Empire, a Hellenistic empire, various Arab caliphates, various Persian empires, especially in Mesopotamia, the Byzantine Empire in Anatolia, and conflicts between the Byzantine and the Persian Empire in some of the same areas that the Ottomans and Persians had conflicts. And then Turkic leading to Ottoman empires, and in between the Arabs and the Turkic Mamluks and other kingdoms and empires. So the main reason is that the Assyrian governing structures and even the Babylonian governing structures had been destroyed, and even the cities were destroyed in many cases. And the population went down considerably compared to ancient times. Places like Nineveh, Babylon had very large populations and irrigation systems and canal systems and trading systems that went even to Lebanon and to India, so that you would see different stones and metals and wood fibers in the imperial palaces and whatnot. A lot of that was destroyed by successive conflicts and invasions, but probably some of the worst occurring from 1100 to 1400, after which the population was very low, and the Ottomans eventually came in and took, as I said, the western part of that whole complex.
And so, within the Ottoman Empire, were the Assyrians living in a largely heterogeneous or homogeneous community? Meaning, were they living amongst many different ethnic groups within the Ottoman Empire, or were they kind of living in communities where it was just only Assyrians primarily? Like, were there Assyrian towns and villages where it was 95% Assyrian?
People speak of maybe the Tir Din region being one of the more compact in terms of the Syrian Orthodox, but in cities like Edessa or Harput or Urmia or Mosul, Christians in general would have been a minority. So they're, by definition, interspersed in all those places. Then in a more rural setting like Hakkari or Nineveh Plains, there would, of course, have been large populations of Kurds, and depending on where you are, Arabs and Turks. So there's a good deal of interspersing there too. In terms of, there were, however, villages, especially Hakkari villages, Urmia Plains or Lake Urmia region villages that would have been predominantly Assyrian. And part of the Assyrian petitions for statehood to the League of Nations and the Versailles Conference would sort of draw maps that would put all these predominantly or significant populations of Assyrians and Syrian speakers uh, on a map, and then connect them all with a border to try to petition for a state of Assyro-Chaldee or Assyro-Chaldea, as it was then known.
And were there any noticeable conflicts between the Assyrians and like the other minority ethnic groups, or even just other ethnic groups like the Kurds and the Turks you mentioned before the period that we call the Assyrian Genocide, like in the mid 1800s, or did these kind of conflict or the persecution of Assyrians really only start in the late 1800s and early 1900s in the Ottoman Empire?
The information I've seen is somewhat spotty between the 14th century and the 19th century. As you may have read, there was sort of I don't know if they call it a rediscovery or a series of missions to the Eastern Christians, and especially the Kurdistan area Christians in the 19th century. The digging up of the ancient Assyrian palaces, and the translation of the ancient Assyrian texts and libraries had brought sort of a renewed interest to the people who were still living in that area. And so then you get to have more correspondence between the Assyrians and outside peoples who have records that have been open to scholars. You see Assyrians writing books and so forth, becoming professors at Columbia or other places, or just being authors and so forth. A good deal of press interest. Newspapers start to write about them. So you don't really see that much before 1800, but there was a general pattern in the Ottoman Empire and in other predecessor empires that if certain communities rose up against the state, they would be put to the sword. And you read about this happening in Hakkari in the 1840s, in Bulgaria in the 1860s, in Greece in the 1820s, and in what some people call Armenia in the 1890s. And so that's that 1894 with some Armenian revolutionary activity. You start to see more massacres of the Armenians and Assyrians in that area. So this is way before World War II. It's like World War I. I'm sorry, it's 20 years before World War I even breaks out. So that's also relevant to a genocide studies framing, because if there had been this, as many people say, this uninterrupted tolerance and good treatment that was only interrupted by the war, and there had been sort of just collateral damage in combat, that would be highly relevant to a defense of no genocidal intent or just accidental civilian damage. But the fact that there was this policy of declaring one race to be the ruling race and other races or peoples or sects to be liable to being collectively put to the sword, that looks today like a discriminatory or derogatory or exterminationist intention or policy.
You mentioned, this long-standing policy of one group ruling and other ethnic groups or religious groups or racial groups that try to rule themselves or separate, being put to the sword. If there was this long-standing policy of that, why then was there this sudden outbreak of putting people to the sword and massacring people in the 1910s and during what we call the Assyrian Genocide?
So there had been a history of either humanitarian intervention or non-Ottoman expansion into Ottoman regions when prior episodes of putting peoples to the sword had occurred. So Russia supported the Greek War of Independence that sort of spared the Greeks from further what they used to call wholesale massacres or genocides after the 1820s. The Balkans started to become either independent or part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and there was some discussion of Russia. Russia did support Balkan independence and the Bulgarian cause. Britain, there was a lot of controversy in Britain about supporting the Bulgarian cause. In Lebanon, France and potentially other Catholic states had an interest in protecting the Catholics of Lebanon. So some of these episodes of wholesale massacre were interrupted by either the threat or the reality of Western intervention. Now, what happened in World War I is relations are ruptured between the Ottoman Empire and the British, French, and Russians. So they don't care anymore what the British, French, and Russians said. They have joined a joint war plan with Germany, which they believe to be the most technologically advanced and agriculturally productive and most effective military of their day. It's kind of like aligned with the United States today, to attack Russia and to invade Russia, and eventually to push towards India and perhaps push west to retake parts of Africa and the Balkans that had been lost to Ottoman control. So if then they see another episode of these peoples being rebellious, like in Greece, like in Bulgaria, like in Lebanon, that had resulted in peoples being put to the sword, they're going to do it on an even broader scale, because now they don't have to be, they can throw away this consideration of Western intervention because they're already at war with the West, with the Allies in the West. They're not at war with Germany and Austria, of course, but with the non-German West.
So it was kind of this like, we don't have the same constraints on our actions that we did prior to the war because we're already at war with the people that we would be previously wary of acting against or acting in a way that is contrary to what they want. Meaning if the British and the French and the West was kind of cause for Ottoman restraint prior to World War I, well then when war had broken out between the Ottomans and the British and the French, then naturally the British and the French are no longer restraining, the Ottomans are no longer wary of what the British and the French are going to do because of their actions, because the war had already started.
Yes, and that's painting with a broad brush. There are exceptions, because there was still a possibility of some kind of intervention or pushback, both from the Ottoman allies and from the Ottoman enemies. On the Ottoman allies side, there were, number one, diplomats, Germans and Austro-Hungarians, and neutral countries and countries with which the Ottomans were not focusing their combat, like the Russians, who would object and say, don't kill the Catholics or the Protestants or whoever that they have an interest in as a diplomat. There's famous cables from the German diplomats in Mosul and Aleppo and so forth. Secondly, especially on the coast, the Ottoman Navy is not necessarily a match for the British and French Navy. So places like Beirut, Haifa, Tyre, Smyrna, and even Istanbul, if they started to kill the local Christians in a wholesale way there, Number one, these places are very perceptible to the Western eye. There's more Westerners there for trade and diplomatic purposes than would be in the interior of Anatolia or Mesopotamia or Syria. So you often read about the Armenians and Assyrians being deported into the interior and then being abused and killed. It's more private. It's kind of like the Germans in World War II. There was less open extermination in Amsterdam or Hamburg or Rome than in interior of Poland, Auschwitz, or interior of Belarus, Ukraine, and occupied Soviet Russia. It's number one, it's hidden from the eye. Number two, it's a war zone. And number three, you're already at war at anybody who would oppose you in that area. Whereas, the Dutch and the Italians and so forth were not that resistant to the Germans until very late in the day sometimes. I don't know if I answered your full question there. Yeah, I was speaking about how it's kind of an overstatement to say there was no remaining fear of intervention, because there were exceptions made, especially for large populations of Armenians in Istanbul, large populations of Christians in Lebanon, and significant pockets of Jews and Christians elsewhere. And really the entire Jewish population was basically spared. Whereas there was some degree of Zionist or other anti-Ottoman activity that could have been used as a pretext to treat Jews like Armenians. And at one point, I believe there was a threat to treat the Jews like the Armenians by one of the relevant governors, but it didn't materialize in a large-scale fashion.
I mean, why were the Ottomans so hard on the Assyrians and also the Armenians? Were they acting in such a way that were either threatening to gain independence from the Ottomans or disrupting the Ottomans' war effort? Like, why was it so important for them to so heavily, eliminate them or send them away from their homes? And what was the purpose of this from a strategic standpoint by the Ottomans?
Yeah, so like with other genocides, the contacts between the local minorities and the rival states of the majority population governed state were used as a reason and sometimes a pretext to target the minority population for being a third column or for stabbing the state in the back. We protected you. We gave you a home. You should have been loyal to us. Now you're rebelling. You're stabbing us in the back. You should be wiped out. That's the Holocaust narrative. Jews are joining the Bolshevik Russians. They are against Germany and the Nazis. Therefore, they should be targeted and persecuted and eventually killed. The Tutsis are in league with Uganda against Rwanda. Uganda is invading Rwanda. Therefore, let's preemptively kill the Tutsis in Rwanda, is the thinking of, genocide perpetrators as articulated by international tribunals sometimes. And there are other examples like this. The Vietnamese in Cambodia are enemies of are going to be allied with the Vietnamese government, which is fighting Cambodia. Therefore, the Khmer Rouge exterminates the Vietnamese of Cambodia. Stuff like that. So in the Ottoman context, the Ottomans had, number one, a historical record of fearing Greek, Bulgarian, and other contacts with Russia. Then they see Armenians coming back and forth from Russia, supposedly with weapons, and starting revolutionary organizations in eastern Anatolia. Then they see letters written from Russia or telegrams from Russia to the Assyrians. At one point, it was proposed that the Assyrians join the Russian Orthodox Church. Another point, the Assyrians just send letters to the British or to the Russians saying, we're being persecuted. Taxation is resulting in us losing most of our crop. Our young women are constantly being abducted We live in a lack of security. People can randomly kill us on the roads, and we don't receive equal justice. Stuff like that. And so they see that they're appealing to the West for protection, just like the Greeks did and the Bulgarians did. That ended up in independence. So we need to put them to the sword like we did the Greeks and the Bulgarians.
Understood. Is there any evidence that there was a serious attempt by the Assyrians to establish their own state and become independent from the Ottomans at this time?
So the Patriarch of the Assyrians declares independence from the Ottoman Empire and war on the Ottoman Empire in spring of 1915. And this is often used to say, well, that there was a regular war, so any resulting violence would be wartime violence and not genocidal violence. However, the attacks on the Assyrians and the destruction of villages had started in 1914, 5 to 6 months previously. So they then had felt like, well, the government has already unleashed its military and allied tribes to destroy our villages. So we have no choice but to take up arms in self-defense. And there had been a tradition of Assyrian independence and self-defense in those mountains. The mountains had been some of the least governed regions of the Ottoman Empire. Communication was not good. The roads were not great. So in the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire realized it had a problem of governance in the east and the mountains, whether it was Kurds or Assyrians or Armenians or Greeks. And it had to, they had councils for propagandizing what's the word in proselytizing Sunni Islam in especially for people like Yazidis or Kurds who they viewed as having maybe irregular or local traditions, and they wanted to have more of an assimilation or an acculturation process. So this tradition of Assyrian and Greek and Kurdish independence and remaining armed was more common in this mountainous area than it would be in the plains area and the cities, where Syrian Orthodox and Catholics were very much on board with the government and conciliatory and saying we're not going to rebel. There was some Syrian Orthodox resistance in the mountains of Tur Abdin, which I cover in my books, and there were Chaldeans, of course, who joined the Assyrian army, and it becomes the army of Assyro-Chaldea. But by and large, it's this kind of resistance and joining the Allies, so to speak, joining England and Russia was more pronounced among the Assyrians than Nestorian Assyrians, by which I mean.
We were talking about the Ottoman policies toward its minorities before the genocide. I was reading it in one of your articles. You were talking about the impact of the Young Turks and their rise to governance in the Ottoman Empire, and kind of the impact of their policies on the ethnic minorities in the Ottoman Empire. Can you just talk about who the Young Turks were and how their policies or their view of the Ottoman Empire and the minorities differed from previous regimes, if at all?
Yeah, so kind of like other, communists and Nazis and other modernist movements, the Young Turks viewed the Sultan and the Sultanate and the Caliphate as backwards, old-fashioned, and in need of modernization. So they wanted to build a homeland and have more freedom and progress. One of the names of the parties is Committee of Union and Progress. A unified nation and civil freedoms. So actually many minorities welcomed this. They had seen this pattern of the monarchy basically committing atrocities throughout the empire. they thought maybe these are westernizing influences on Ottoman politics, and they supported them. Some minorities supported the Young Turk movement, the modernization movement. But as I mentioned before, the some of the leading Young Turks thought, well, what we need to do is have a Germanic style modernization, which would be militaristic and expansionist, and also modern in the sense of modern nationalism, which is even if you're not rebelling, everybody has to assimilate and have the same language, culture, education, and almost religion. They didn't necessarily say that in the beginning, but some of their theorists said things like that, which is people need to have the same culture if they're going to be in the same country, which is not the idea of the old caliphates, which is we can extract taxes from you and you can submit to us whether or not you join our religion. There were pressures to join the caliphate's religion under various caliphates, but there were these surviving pockets that, if they didn't rebel, could even grow in size. And under the late Sultanate, actually, there was a push for even more tolerance than that. The concessions were given to the Western powers to say, stop intervening in our internal affairs. We will grant greater protections against unjust taxation and unjust treatment in the courts to the minority communities. We'll convene a parliament. The Tanzimat period. We'll have a constitutional monarchy. But with the 1890s rebellion, with a series of coups in the early 1900s and in 1912, this more tolerant period starts coming to an end.
So it sounds like the Young Turks were pursuing a policy of like Turkification of the Ottoman Empire. Is that?
That's what it becomes called in 1912 and onwards, and it becomes the theory of the Ministry of Education and the political parties law and the media law, which is you cannot say or teach that there are multiple peoples and nations inside of Turkey. Everybody has to say they're a Turk, and everyone's a Turk, and there's mountain Turks and non-mountain Turks, but there's no Kurds and Turks, and there are Christian Turks, but there are no like Assyrian nation Christians remnant here, and there's no Armenian nation remnant here. Those are all myths.
How did you mentioned the role of Russia in assisting not just the Bulgarians and the Greeks, but also helping Armenians and Assyrians? What other key strategic actors or global actors were either helping these minority groups, these minority Christian groups in the Ottoman Empire at the time, or were actually assisting the Ottomans, like the Germans, I don't know, or the Austrian-Hungarians, as you mentioned, who were allies of the Ottomans at the time?
Yeah, so there were probably one of the most negative influences was the German influence, and not all Germans. There were sort of two schools of thought within the Germans. One is that let's not bring shame upon ourselves and our side in the war by committing atrocities, especially against Christians, because most of our people are also Christians and most of the Austro-Hungarians are also Christians. So why do we want to conspire against fellow Christians in a world war? It makes us look like the evil side versus England and Russia. Whereas previously Germany had thought they had a bit of a moral high ground because Russia was this backwards feudalistic nation with serfs, and England had done all these things, and India and North America, and the list goes on and on, Ireland, whereas Germany had been, sort of on the defense against Napoleon and so forth, and won that conflict in 1812 and so on. So that was one part of the Germans. The other part of the Germans was we need to have our own colonies and imitate the successful actions of the English and the French in creating cash cows out of foreign nations like India, Vietnam, and Indonesia, and so forth, in the case of the Dutch, and Brazil in the case of the Portuguese, and so forth. How do you do that? Well, they had their African colonies like Namibia, and then they had the plan to build a railroad from Europe to Mesopotamia and send people to grow food and gain living space, not in Russia like in World War II, but in Mesopotamia, Syria, and Armenia along this railroad. So there was one theory of the German geopoliticians, the theorists of geopolitics, that this will be like a dagger in the heart of Eurasia, and we will control the central productive core of Eurasia. Probably Ukraine had a part to play in it too, as a breadbasket of Europe, but we'd have these two breadbaskets in addition to Germany. Hitler kind of replaces that with a Soviet and Ukrainian breadbasket. And so part of that plan is the local Christians need to either join as like colonial labor, kind of like the French and the British would basically enslave people for manual labor in Africa and Asia to build railroads, to build roads, the corvée system. And they could work in kind of quasi unfree fashion on these new farms and railroads and infrastructure projects, or they could be replaced. And eventually it goes in that direction. So that's a very negative influence, the German one. Now, within the Germans, when the war starts, some Germans, as I say, appeal to stop killing the Christians, and especially the Protestants, and so for the Catholics. The English are also divided. The Greeks are divided, and the Russians eventually become divided because of the Bolshevik Revolution. A lot of the Assyrian position collapses, and the remaining people are massacred as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1918. The French also adopt a double role or a betrayal stance by taking the Kemalist side after they start to experience losses in Silesia and other places, and they're generally in a bad economic and social situation after the war because they've lost millions of men. And Italy, same thing.
I mean, you mentioned that most of the killing happened when they would force people kind of into the inner parts of the Ottoman Empire and try to make these killings like as hidden as possible. Is there any argument that these different groups, like the Germans, like the English, like the French, like the Italians and the Greeks, weren't necessarily aware of the extent to which the killing of Christians in the Ottoman Empire were actually taking place, because it was, as you said, the Ottomans were trying to hide it? Or do you think that there's evidence that the British and the French and the Germans knew exactly what was taking place, and as you said, for just strategic reasons, they decided either not to do anything or to kind of play it safe?
There is a certain amount of doubt that went on. In spring of 1915, there's the famous letter where Britain, France, and Russia say that there are new crimes against humanity and civilization being committed against the Christians of the Ottoman Empire. So that by that time, they've almost adopted a whole new category of crimes against humanity, which previous to this had mostly been used for the slave trade and not for massacres and genocides. And the term genocide is not even really coined until 1943. So the things that are used for genocide before 1943 are crimes against humanity, wholesale massacre, populations put to the sword, and extermination and slaughter. And you find a lot of these words in the diplomatic correspondence and in the press and in the books about from the time, and some books have this as their title, the Armenian Massacre or Death of a Nation is one of the Assyrian books, or I don't know if there was an article called The Greatest Crime in History, I believe. Um, Winston Churchill called it a new Holocaust, I think. I don't know what year that was, maybe I don't know, it was 1916 or I believe there was another famous use of the word Holocaust that was I don't know if it was in Danish. It's in an article by a Danish scholar, but so the word Holocaust was also used. But there was still some uncertainty because what is the numerical extent? It's not like today where there's number one, film, number two, smartphone video. In those days, there was almost no film, almost no cameras and video cameras. It was theoretically possible, but there was very little ownership of those things. Number two, there was no telephone, and there were just telegraphs, and most people didn't have access to it. And in war, one of the first things you do is you either occupy the telegraph office or cut the wire. So it's disrupted even if you have it. So the communication is very poor. And then there's a lot of confusion and conflicting reports. Some people will try to put a rosy, paint a rosy picture, kind of like when the Germans would take people to Theresienstadt and other concentration camps, say things are not that bad, and they would get some local people who were being detained to say, I'm being treated well, to the Red Cross or whoever. So they would cover it up. So there are probably some people who are pressured to say things are fine. And so you receive conflicting reports. And that's even when you get reports. And many times you don't even get the report. But sometimes they didn't get a lot of reports. There were the reports that led them to make the declaration. There were a lot of Greeks who go to Greece and say what happened to them. They've been deported from the Black Sea coast or from the coast around Istanbul and Sea of Marmara, and they describe what happened to the other Greeks, or they go to London and have a meeting about that. But it's more spotty than it would be today. But as you can see today, every time there's an alleged genocide today, there's still a lot of debate about, is it really happening? What's the number? They deny it. They try to bring some people out to say it's not so bad where I live, and so forth.
Well, I mean, touched on that debate about how people call it, what the different names are. Today, what is the criteria for labeling something, labeling a crime as a genocide, as opposed to just a massacre or mass killing, or some other kind of atrocity?
Yes, it's even contested today what the rules are. There are judicial decisions and scholarly and UN commentaries, some of which take a very broad approach to what a genocide is or could be, and some of which take a very narrow approach. Some people would like to say, for example, in the World Court or the International Court, in the International Criminal Court, that if you do not kill the entire surviving population and you let them flee, that's ethnic cleansing and not a genocide. It could be an extermination, it could be a murder, it could be a war crime, it could be a variety of things that's not a genocide because you lack the intent, the specific intent to destroy. And they read the term destroy to mean destroy completely. Even though textually, number one, the Genocide Convention says in whole or in part. That's textually. Then contextually, when they were framing the crime, they cited all these examples that were in part. The number one example that it was framed around was the Holocaust. And the Holocaust in every single country was in part. It ranged from 90% of the Jewish population to less than 10% was killed. It depended upon local conditions, collaboration, number of camps, scenarios of conflict and scarcity and so forth in the area. But it was varied greatly. And then that's not to mention all the other examples people cited. So Raphael Lemkin, who came up with the idea of genocide, said we should have a crime that's not primarily about the individual, but it's about the culture of the individual. You're attacking their culture or their nation or their religion. So it should be about, losing the distinctive cultural contributions and geniuses that come from having different types of peoples in the world. So he cited a number of examples to the UN drafting committee and to other governments and so forth, went on the media and wrote articles and all this kind of thing. He cites the Armenians from World War One as a prime example besides the Holocaust. It's probably the most common one he cites besides the Holocaust is Armenians. Then he cites the Assyrians in 1933 in Iraq, the Sameila massacre, on several occasions. Then he talks about things like German colonies and ancient Rome, the Christians of ancient Rome, of course, who were not completely exterminated, or there'd be no Christians today if they had squelched it in the bud. I suppose there'd be no Western Christians. There still could have been Eastern Christians. And he also cites things like the Crusades, medieval wars, and the siege of Magdeburg, sort of Protestant versus Catholic warfare and massacre. So all of his examples are in part. And there are many examples of groups not even all being deported at the same time. And even if they were all deported, not everybody was killed. So that's why I criticize this narrow interpretation that you sometimes see.
So on your understanding, it's not necessarily about the numerical number of people that are killed and the proportion of a certain ethnic, religious, national or racial group that are killed. It's about the intent to try to target those specific groups because they belong to that specific group. Is that more
well,
or less
the
correct?
number does go to the intent, because if the number is very low as a percentage of the group, and if there are other reasons why you could be doing this, it tends to rebut the idea that you are targeting the group for its groupness. So, for example, the United States, D-Day, and the invasion of Italy in World War II, they start dropping bombs on Normandy, southern France, eastern France, Sicily, southern Italy, Naples, all these places, because there are Germans there and Italian troops, and they're ejecting them. But they kill like tens of thousands of French and Italian civilians, maybe 100, let's say 100,000 in both cases. It's still not a genocide of the French or Italians by the United States, because they are engaging in combat with these other forces who are large, who have conquered this area, and they're ejecting them. And these other people are being hit incidentally. They're not being rounded up and have their heads cut off, by and large, maybe sometimes. Or they're not being rounded up and physically abused and starved in a small camp or something. Or their children are not being taken by the U.S. soldiers as their own children. These are some of the things that the Genocide Convention uses to distinguish war from genocide: deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of the group or in whole or in part, transferring children from the victim group to the perpetrator group, inflicting serious bodily or mental harm on the group with the intent to destroy the group in whole or in part. These are different from, I'm bombing your city because I'm at war with you and you're defending it.
So in the Assyrian case, we don't necessarily need admission from Ottoman officials or the Ottoman government that they are intending to completely destroy or in part destroy the Assyrian populations, because if their actions indicate that they had intent on doing this and the results of their actions indicate this, so you're saying that we can then infer from those actions that they had a genocidal intent against the Assyrians?
Yes, and though it is very helpful to have admissions, and there are a variety of missions that I look at and other people look at, things that were said to the American ambassador, things that were said in memoirs after the war. Hakan Dadrian went through all that stuff because he read Turkish, and collected things there. Things that the Germans said that somebody told them. These were allies, and sometimes these were confidential German cables. So why would they lie to their own government about something negative that their own ally had told them? So these are very helpful, but it's not necessary. And there are two examples that I often look at as to why it's not necessary: Bosnia, Srebrenica, and Kosovo. So Yugoslavia, the government of Yugoslavia would say, we have nothing in the abstract against the Bosnian Muslims or the Kosovar Muslims. We've lived with them in peace since World War II. Their population has increased. We've electrified their areas and given them education and food and jobs and all these other things. But now they're rebelling in league with our historic colonizer, Turkey. So we have to go to war with these rebellious villages and cities and bombard them with artillery and, take up trench positions like in Ukraine and fight until we can reach a peace deal, which they said they were trying to do. Well, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and other people say, no, you have a genocidal intent because we see that in Srebrenica, hundreds of men have disappeared after you took over the city of Srebrenica, and we're inferring from that action, rounding people up and killing them, that you want to exterminate the Bosnian Muslim group. Plus, you've said publicly you're seeking revenge against the Bosnians, you're seeking revenge against the Kosovar terrorists and so forth. So we see that 44 people have been killed in the village of Ratsak in Kosovo. So NATO declares a genocide. Germany, United States, England declare a genocide and go to war against Yugoslavia over Kosovo, even though the government of Yugoslavia had been sitting down with the Kosovar side and having peace talks. And before the rebellion had started, had built them up. You could argue, statistically, it wasn't a complete defense that they made these protestations that no, we have a good reason and a legitimate purpose and so forth. And number two, it wasn't a complete defense that there were so many survivors. And there were so many survivors in Bosnia and Kosovo that the victim group became the government of the area where the genocide supposedly occurred. Whereas today, if the Assyrians and the Armenians governed Eastern Anatolia, who would talk about the Armenian and Assyrian genocide? Nobody. If they had their own states there, nobody would talk about it. But they talk about it, even though there is a Bosnian state and a Kosovar, like statelet. Some people recognize it, some people don't. But it exists. And so I look at some of this jurisprudence to say the mere fact that there was a rebellion and that you do not admit it is not the final factor.
So you mentioned that there actually were some examples of the Ottoman officials admitting intent to commit genocidal actions. And I was just wondering if you could give one or two examples of that proof of the admission or intent to commit those genocidal actions against the Assyrians at the time.
Yeah, so the military commander Rashid Bey said he exterminated the Assyrians of Persian Azerbaijan. One of the ruling triumvirate, Jamal Pasha, said that the Christians had to be targeted, or they suffered what they did because they had taken the wrong side, basically. And he basically admitted to overdoing it or a broad approach, you could say, in his memoirs. There are things that were said by the special organization, the Ottoman sort of you could call it like a CIA or a covert unit that would work with criminals and local tribes people to do like non-conventional operations, not the conventional army, but the special operations. And there is a variety of like euphemisms for extermination in their records. The deportation documents. I think Taner Achem wrote a book called what was it called? The Armenian Genocide Cables, or something like that. The telegrams, the Armenian Genocide telegrams, something like that. Where there's been a longstanding debate about do the telegrams from Central Ottoman Command, Istanbul or the war front, to the regional military commanders and sort of civilian security officers and governors, do these reflect that the Armenians are going to be resettled from the conflict zone in an orderly manner and provided with food and housing, or that they're basically going to be rounded up and pushed into the interior where local tribes will have their way with them and they will be almost naked and certainly undefended. And then we will distribute their homes and businesses among Turks and refugees from the Balkan Wars and Circassia. There's a few telegrams that say that, there might be some food coming, or we're going to build a barracks in Syria for people who've been deported from Armenian towns in Anatolia. But there's also a variety of telegrams that indicate that there are massacres going on. People are arriving without the menfolk. The women are being abused. The children are being distributed. People cannot return to their villages. They're enemies of the state, and all this kind of thing, which you would also read like in a Nazi telegram or in a Rwandan genocide sort of document. There are conflicting documents in the Rwandan genocide too. I mean, there are some interesting articles if you look up the scholarship of the defense lawyers for the Rwandan genocide suspects, where they try to defend their client and say that there are documents indicating their innocence as well as their guilt. There might be some incriminating documents, there might be some exculpatory documents, and this is almost always the case. Even in Nuremberg, a variety of defendants said there are documents that indicate I was not all bad. Even Eichmann said there are some documents that exonerate me, this or that. I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm just saying that's what lawyers and the accused sometimes say. And sometimes they can find a paragraph here or there that supports their position. So yeah, I believe there are these admissions in the documentary record. Vakan Dadrin did a lot of them. Taner Achem did a lot of them. I found some others, but a lot of the ground was covered by them before I even really got on the scene. So I have to credit them.
I mean, I'm assuming that modern day Turkey, or Turkey in any period, has not publicly or officially acknowledged this genocide. What are some of the arguments that the Turkish government or people who deny this as a genocide, what are some of the arguments that they...
Yeah, interestingly, the government has actually admitted it probably several times, I would argue. Number one, the Treaty of Sèvres led to basically an armistice and so forth. It's kind of like a Treaty of Versailles for the eastern part of the war. And part of it said that there were massacres during the war of non-Christian subjects. And it describes several of the acts that the other documents and admissions describe as happening to the non-Christian subjects. First of all, massacres, but some other things too. Loss of lands. So the Sultan signs that. That's what it's like, Truman's representative and the Emperor's representative signing the thing on the ship to end World War II with Japan. Like someone has to sign this thing. It's the government representative. And they can't do it on their own just because they're a clerk of the army or whatever. That's number one. Number two, the current president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, said one time that the old governments had done like fascistic ethnic cleansing or something like this, or there had been fascistic acts by past governments. And I guess he was trying to do it to like contrast, like now we have a justice and development party, I think is what his party is called. But before there was like unjust fascistic leadership, the Kemalists, and before that the Ottoman Sultan. We're like way beyond them. But it's for the state, it's an admission. Then there's a variety of other things where they put documents on their website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs saying, oh, yes, there were massacres of Armenians, but it was during a chaotic situation, and there were survivors. So they think they're defending themselves by saying, well, there were survivors and there was not a complete eradication, but it's actually highly incriminating because, like I said before, complete extermination is not required. I don't know if I answered your whole question.
No, you did. The other part of it, which, I mean, the question was based on the premise that the Ottomans have denied it and made a case why it wasn't a genocide. And then the second part of that question was, what are the arguments for it not being called a genocide? And it sounds like some of them are that it was during war and that there were survivors, as you just said.
Yeah, no, and the third one would be there were also Turkish and Kurdish civilians who were killed, including killed by Armenians and Assyrians. So those are probably the top three, but some others might be like numerical arguments, like the number of Armenians and Assyrians was not that high in the first place. Number two, the number of survivors was actually very high. So they would say that there were originally only 1.1 or 1.2 million Armenians who had not voluntarily migrated to Russia already in 1914. And then there were 800,000 at the end of the war. So the deduction is 300,000 to 400,000, not 1 million or 1.2 million or 1.5 million, all of which you see Armenian genocide scholars quoting. The actual original records, some of the German records, they talk about 1.5 million as of 1918 to 1920, just Armenians. But, you know, there's various numerical arguments you can make to minimize the original population and maximize the residual population to say that it was not a majority that was killed, or it was a relocation, or whatever. So as to the first point, as I said before, all these genocides that Lemkin listed and that tribunals have discovered have occurred during some kind of a war: World War II, Rwandan Civil War, Yugoslav Civil War, Cambodian international wars, Myanmar Civil War. There's a few that don't involve a war. The UN once spoke about the Iranian extermination of the Baha'i faith or Baha'i leaders, but there was the Iran-Iraq War at that time. And people talk about Chinese Uyghurs sometimes, like the United States. Is that a civil war? Probably not. So there's a war in most of these cases that have resulted in a conviction or a theory as to why it's a genocide. Number two, the survivors. I think I already addressed that. Number three, the Turkish and Kurdish victims. And here I note that the Germans actually have a much better argument, and the Hutus have a much better argument for victims on their side than the Turks or the Kurds in World War I. Because, of course, Germany lost like millions of people, and the cities were turned utter rubble, including the capital city, which didn't happen to Istanbul or Smyrna, the nice city on the coast, or Ankara, or several other cities. They still have their ancient, churches and mosques and everything, whereas a lot of the stuff in Germany and Japan was totally destroyed. So that's not a good defense that you had civilian victims on your side. Also, they were invading 3 continents: Asia, Europe, and Africa. Or in the period that they include as suffering all these casualties, like from 1820 to 1924, they had operations in all 3 continents. So that's a huge place in which to say, oh, we lost all these soldiers. Well, of course, you're trying to fight 100 different peoples. It doesn't mean you didn't perpetrate genocide. And the Germans, similarly, they lost men against the French resistance. against the Dutch resistance in Russia, in Yugoslavia, in Greece, in Poland, against the Americans, bomb from the air, blockade, poison gas in World War One. It's not a defense. No one's ever considered that to be defense, that you had all these. Now, it can be a defense sometimes when there's like mutual combat and, both sides are suffering civilian casualties in the context of, let's say, Russia and Ukraine. They both fire missiles at each other's cities. The proportions and the modalities are relevant to whether there's a genocide or not. And maybe if Ukraine suffers a huge number of civilian casualties, they could use that as an excuse for why any civilian casualties they cause in Russia are not a genocide but a self-defense. It's relevant, but it's not the defense that they often think that it is. Of course, the Serbs in the Yugoslav wars suffered a large number of civilian casualties on their side. The Hutus, no one ever mentions this, but Hutus, according to UN records, they were suffering tens of thousands of civilian deaths every month. And the Hutus are also, they go beyond Rwanda. If you include the Hutus in the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's possible that more Hutus have died in this whole 30 years of conflict, since the 80s or the early 90s than Tutsis, which you can't say about Turks and Kurds versus Armenians and Assyrians, most likely. If you believe the 1.5 million Armenian thing, it's definitely not true. And if you include Greeks, it's probably not true either. And if you look at the statistics, which I often do, for Turkey after the war, the Christians were like 4%, to 8% before the World War One period. Then they were less than 1%. And there were 12 million Turks and Kurds remaining. And today, sometimes Kurds say that there are 15 to 20 million Kurds just in Turkey. So how could there have been this massive targeting of Kurds if you have all these Kurds surviving, and not just surviving, but growing to where, there are only less than 100,000 Armenians and 10 million Kurds. And the Armenians and the Kurds used to be a similar number in the late Ottoman Empire. So there's a vast disparity today, which is more like what you would see with the German Jews or the Polish Jews or something like that than what you would see with like two-state wars, where it's kind of like balanced.
What is the number of Assyrians remaining in the kind of Mesopotamian region or modern day Turkey or former Ottoman Empire today?
It's difficult to say. I mean, some people say that there used to be 2 million Christians in Syria, 1.5 million in Iraq, 150 to 250,000 in Turkey, and 50 to 100,000 in Iran, not including like the Protestants who are Persian, with which there's a very wide range of estimates, because who knows? It's almost illegal to be a Protestant who used to be a Persian Muslim. So that you have to ignore that part of it. But since the Iraq and Syria wars and aggressions, probably there are more like 150,000 in Syria and maybe 250 to 300,000 in Iraq. But some people say higher numbers in Syria than lower numbers in Iraq. And it's hard to say because who's going to go count them? Some of these places have basically been destroyed, like Tel Tamer and the Kabul area and Aleppo. And so it's not a very good place to do a study. Last time I think they did a decent study of Iraq was 2006 in terms of, trying to estimate civilian casualties. I think people try to update it, do it using other ways, like in PLOS1, the journal. But I don't think it's by and large due to doing a new nationwide survey of have your relatives been killed in the war. Plus, even if you did that, all the people who, some members of their family were killed by ISIS, so they fled Syria for Armenia, or they fled Iraq for Australia, you wouldn't get them because you're doing a study in Iraq and Syria. You're not doing a study in Australia and Armenia. You'd have to do like this global diasporic study to even figure it out. The death toll, I mean. So it's hard to estimate any of these things.
What is? I mean, we talked about the cases for it being called a genocide, and you kind of debunked some of the defenses for it not being called a genocide. I'm just wondering why in your opinion is it important for this to be called a genocide versus just a massacre? Like, what are the implications and the benefits, I guess, of labeling it as a genocide or it being classified as a genocide as opposed to just mass murder or killing?
Well, as you know, like generally, if a government like murders or tortures somebody, there's no result of the state crime of murder and torture. You know, they're sovereign. They often have sovereign immunity. You might have heard the Supreme Court oral argument where they're talking about what if the president drone strikes his political opponent? Is he immune? And the majority's like, yeah. So, but sometimes this was Lemkin's original idea that genocide should be different than all that because, you know, we might not want to have a international court or anytime somebody like is in a gunfight with the police, you know, the governor goes on trial at The Hague. That would be an unwieldy and intrusive system that would undermine sovereignty. But at the same time, it would take sovereignty too far to say, yeah, you can just get rid of one of your components of your people and call it sovereignty. Sovereignty has limits, and one of the limits is preserving the living forces of humanity and the biodiversity, you could call it today, although he didn't have that word, of the species. So where you start to threaten the survival of a group, there should be a variety of consequences that ensue. And the Genocide Convention talks about a couple. It talks about prevention. So there should be a way to prevent it. And the United Nations had recently been formed with the Security Council. Now the Security Council, when they debated it, it doesn't necessarily have the right to intervene in every domestic issue and say you're doing this wrong. But they have had a record of intervening where there's a domestic pattern of atrocity that also threatens international consequences and to destabilize the peace. So that's one. It also talks about the states parties may establish an international criminal court. Well, of course, that didn't work out so well because it took them 50 years to even have an ICC treaty. In the meantime, they created these mini tribunals like Yugoslavia, and the United States and Russia did not even join the International Criminal Court as ratifying parties. Maybe they can be subject to it anyway if somebody like Afghanistan or Ukraine joins the court, you know, hasn't been adjudicated to its finality, to its final conclusion. But it's not going to be very effective anyway if there's no extradition process. And so the third thing is civil. And this is a lot of what I focus on because it's like the most realistic. And a lot of the Security Council interventions against genocide actually end up being almost worse than the cause. We could talk about that, but it's a big topic. But you could talk about the Iraq sanctions as an example of that. Not an intervention against genocide necessarily, but some people use genocide-like language in 1990 to justify that. But the third thing is civil. That's the World Court. One country should be able to sue the other country for reparations in the World Court, and the World Court can issue reparations. And it's not a criminal thing. It's a civil thing. There could be an order to stop. There could be symbolic remedies like establish a monument to the victims, apologize, count the victims, and let them return to their homes, like the Treaty of Sèvres said. That's why I said that one book that the Treaty of Sèvres was very forward-looking, because it looks forward 100 years early to today. What some people are saying is like, if Uganda invades the Congo and Rwanda invades the Congo, and all these people are massacred and the women are abused and people lose their homes, there should be an order in the World Court that they can return to their homes, the survivors, if they want to, in in the Congo and receive some kind of material reparation from Rwanda or Uganda. And that only started happening like in 2005, whereas the Treaty of Sèvres already said this in 1920. So that's what should have happened to the Armenians and Assyrians and the Greeks, is there should have been some kind of repair of at least part of the wrong. Some parts of it can't be repaired. And that's what happened after World War II. Is number one, the Allies would just start handing out like gold and houses to Jewish victims and displaced persons affected by the Nazi abuses, and take businesses away from the pro-Hitler industrialists and whatnot. I guess to a limited degree, but there was this denazification program. And then there was this much larger process that began of Jews submitting claims and there being like an international claims process to obtain reparations from banks and insurance companies and the state and all these other things. Plus establishing a whole country, for their benefit that Germany ended up subsidizing.
I mean, how would reparations and kind of or symbolic gestures to acknowledge the Assyrian genocide, how would that happen today? Because the Ottoman Empire obviously no longer stands and the Assyrians don't have a sovereign state. So how could that take place in today? And how could the Assyrians get some kind of financial support or reparations, as you said, for what happened to them?
Yeah, I talk about several analogies to this. A lot of Armenians, American and Armenian from Armenia and Armenian European scholars talk about what if the state of Armenia brought this claim against the state of Turkey. That's one thing for Armenians. And there are some Assyrians who live in Armenia who could benefit from that. But it's still very difficult and probably time barred and a variety of other things. So that's not the best alternative. There are things that have lawsuits that have been filed by individual Jews and Jewish institutions, like Chabads, or individual Jews like the Altman plaintiff who had a Klimt painting from the movie The Woman in Red, I think it's called, led to a case of Altman versus the Republic of Austria. That's another case where a Jewish person had their Coca-Cola franchise expropriated by the Nasserists in Egypt, who had an anti-Semitic motive allegedly. So that was like an illegal conversion and expropriation. Some Bosnian Muslim victims have sued Bosnian Serb alleged perpetrators in the United States and gotten orders of reparation from them. So I talk about some of these things. Theoretically, you could also bring a case like in a place like the European Court of Human Rights that Turkey has joined into, or a country like Iraq or Syria could have sued Turkey not for the Ottoman times, but for the supporting of ISIS and other rebel groups in the post-Ottoman times. That has led to a lot of the survivors of the Ottoman Christian genocide, places like Deir el-Zor, Nineveh Plains, Aleppo, led to them being displaced again or killed. But now, of course, Syria is not going to do that, and Iraq probably won't do it either, but they theoretically could have. And it might have been some deterrent to this explosion of aggression that we've seen in the region.
I mean, so you talked about, the way that Assyrians and Christians in the Middle East have been continually persecuted, not just during, the Ottoman Empire and the Assyrian Genocide, but also even, you mentioned the 1930s in Iraq, and obviously, in the 21st century, there's been a lot of violence against Christians and Assyrians in the Middle East. I'm wondering if you think that the lack of recognition that the Assyrian genocide has gotten has helped enable or allow the continued persecution of the Assyrians and other Christians in the Middle East after the Assyrian genocide and even today.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, every time you see There could be instability in Serbia, like a news report. People will say, "Oh, we can't have that because there'll be a return to the genocide of the '90s." Or there's some kind of Hutu extremism in Rwanda. Oh, we can't have that. It's going to be a return to the genocide of the 1990s. But if you don't remember the Ottoman Christian genocide and there's extremism in the region, you might ignore it for many years because you've never heard of this kind of a threat, or it doesn't remind you of anything. I call that the reverse CNN effect. The CNN effect is this concept in it's kind of like journalism and genocide studies where some conflicts get picked out of all the conflicts and elevated to be like, that's the important conflict. Everyone has to pay attention to Sarajevo. Everyone has to pay attention to Kuwait. Everyone has to pay attention to Kiev. But you don't have to pay attention to Sana'a, Yemen. You don't have to pay attention to Tigray, Ethiopia. You don't have to pay attention to Christians in Nigeria. These are like the reverse CNN effect. So I argue this is what happened to a lot of these victims of ISIS and Al Qaeda in Iraq and Syria, is that it didn't remind people of anything, so they didn't announce a lot of warnings and never again, and we can't allow this to happen again, and so forth. And after it started happening, and there was some attention, it very quickly like, okay, we're tired of this. Let's move on to the next thing that's like more significant, like Ukraine. So let's forget about Iraq completely. So these Yazidis are still displaced and poor in the areas occupied by ISIS and Assyrians. But you've never heard a word about it since 2022 because it's all about Ukraine 24 hours a day. That's the CNN effect, or the reverse CNN effect in the case of the Yazidis.
Is there a particular reason why you think, that these other kind of ethnic groups like the Assyrians, like the Yazidis, are kind of victims of what you call the reverse CNN effect, where they just are not paid attention to by, mass media and, many different outlets and just in the front of people's minds more generally? Like, is it just because it's in a part of the world or that people don't know about, or that their populations are relatively small so people don't think about it as much? Like, what do you think is the reason why, as you said, they're victims to this reverse CNN effect?
Yeah, I mean, many of the countries that get a lot of attention, they have a lot of other countries with the same ethnic group or religion to defend them and like care about them. It's kind of like how France, tried to care about the Catholics in Lebanon. I mentioned in 1860. So like Kuwait, one of George H.W. Bush's, first points about Iraq invading Kuwait is a member of the Arab League. Can't have this. Well, what league is Assyria a member of? None. It doesn't even exist. Armenia might be the member of some league like, I don't know, UN or something, but everyone's a member of that. So it doesn't necessarily get you that far. And the other thing that you see is diaspora populations. Sometimes there are large diaspora populations of the conflict that's supposed to be important in other countries. They bring attention to it. And while there is an Assyrian diaspora population, it's just very small compared to certain other populations that are larger and bring attention to their conflicts and victimizations.
So, I mean, what
perversely, I've mentioned this before, is perversely that means almost like the worse your genocide, the less it's going to be remembered, because there's literally no one around to remember it. And there are some people like Raphael Lemkin mentions, they're like tribes from Canada or Australia, they just 100% do not exist anymore. And therefore, it's very poorly remembered because there's no one to even ever talk about it every year. Other people have survivors, so they can talk about it every year. That's kind of a perverse thing about reverse CNN effect and memory of genocide.
I mean, so then what can be done in the present moment besides kind of continuing to just raise awareness for the Assyrian genocide and the persecution of Assyrians, what can be done to prevent further escalation of violence and prevent it from getting to the point where there's almost like no Assyrians left, and then it's just completely forgotten because there's just one or two people left who actually are Assyrian and can speak about it, but they're not getting enough, they're not getting enough news attention, or they're not getting a microphone to actually speak about it.
Yeah, I mean, there could have been like UN safe areas or something. That's what a lot of genocide scholars talk about, is like declaring safe areas. Was tried in Bosnia. Actually, the Bosnian population has increased a lot in some of those areas. But the problem with it is, the nations who are in the United Nations have to contribute a lot of troops and money to fund all this, and they're off suffering such horrible problems that they don't want to contribute that much money. Number two, a lot of them are at each other's throats, so they can't cooperate on such a big project. Was that a relic of an era in the 1990s after the Soviet Union collapsed and people were kind of like more on the same page? There could be UN interventions. So in the alternative to that, there's refugee admissions. So I've written about refugee admissions in a couple of pieces, and it was used for displaced persons from the Holocaust. There was a passport system before Raphael Lemkin. The person who was kind of like most like Raphael Lemkin was called Fridtjof Nansen, the League of Nations sort of, I forget what his title was, some kind of commissioner of the League of Nations, and had a passport system for people who were no longer protected by their country, which is a concept that's been taken up by refugee law. Is like you have a well-founded fear of persecution, like you're not protected. And it could even be private persecution. So a lot of Assyrians and Yazidis and other people and Kurds and Arabs and everyone have obtained refugee status in other countries. Assyrians in Australia, United States, Europe, and Yazidis in Germany and so forth, Austria. That's probably the main one that's meaningful, but even that is like reaching not its brightest moment, because there's fatigue with migration, and there are high housing costs, and there are perceived national security risks. Like national security is an exception to the duty to accept certain refugees. So, that era, they're talking about sending a lot of people back to Syria, despite Syria being, occupied by you-know-who these days. So, if they're considering that, what are other people like from Iraq supposed to expect? It's hard to say.
Okay, my last question for you is, you've written a lot about the Assyrian Genocide. You've given talks on the Assyrian Genocide and just genocide of Christians in the Middle East more broadly. I'm just wondering why are you particularly so interested in this subject and in the Assyrian Genocide specifically?
It's part of like my family's history in a way. That's part of it. It's an interesting subject for the 21st century, I find, because people started mentioning Assyrians more after 2001 and 2003. So you started to see more journalistic interest in it. So then articles would come out about people's experiences and different families, and it was possible to think about the history of those areas in that way. It's kind of like if today all of a sudden there was a flare up in Rwanda, people would start thinking about the Rwandan genocide again more often. And then the more I got into the law, the legal history of it, the more I found that Assyrians had a more central role than has been acknowledged. So I think it's important to acknowledge that, to get the meaning of genocide right, you have to get the study of the Assyrian genocide right, because the Assyrians were cited as one of the examples to frame the treaty. That was one of the reasons to have this treaty. So if you don't understand what happened in 1933 or what happened in World War I, You're not going to understand why we have this treaty, and you're not going to understand the context of these words, which is going to lead to the wrong conclusions in the 21st century.
Understood. Okay. Do you have any, upcoming research or projects or articles / books that you're working on that you'd like to just share or kind of highlight to people watching or listening?
Upcoming, I think almost everything has come out. There was a book that came out from Rutledge in 2013, The Greek Genocide by Acham and Kyriakides and Christo Kyriakides, I believe. And there was a book that came out in 2018. I think you mentioned the Assyrian Genocide, Cultural and Political Legacies. That unfortunately, it only covers about up to the period of 2016 or 2017. But that does, I think, as indicated by the title, try to draw some lines of political connection and legacy from what happened in World War I to what happened in 2014 to 2017.
Okay, well, Professor Travis, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. It was really interesting and such a pleasure to have you. So thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me.